Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Emma Robinson, and I'm the project manager for the Nonreligion in a Complex Future project. I would like to warmly welcome you to today's panel. While we gather virtually for this event from places near and far, we acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of all lands that we are on today and acknowledge the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples across Canada. The Nonreligion in a Complex Future project is based at the University of Ottawa. Please join us as we pay respect to the Algonquin people who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. Thank you. I will now take a moment to introduce today's panelists. Laurie Beaman, the host of today's panel, is the Canada Research Chair in Religious Diversity and Social Change and a professor in the Department of Classics and Religious Studies at the University of Ottawa. She is also the principal investigator of the Nonreligion in a Complex Future project. Her current and engaged areas of research include nonreligion, human-non-human relationships, equality, law, and religious diversity. Peter Beyer is a professor of religious studies in the Department of Classics and Religious Studies at the University of Ottawa as well, and is co-investigator on the Nonreligion in a Complex Future project. In recent years, his research has focused on examining changing patterns of religious identity in the Canadian population over the last 2 decades, longitudinal research with second-generation immigrants, and developing research instruments and theory for the examination of non-religion in Canada and beyond. Brian Clarke is an adjunct member of faculty at Emmanuel College in Victoria University, the Toronto School of Theology, and is a collaborator on the Nonreligion in a Complex Future project. His areas of research include religion and ethnicity, religion and public life, and contemporary patterns of disengagement from organized religion. Sarah Wilkins-LaFlamme is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology and Legal Studies at the University of Waterloo, and a collaborator on the Nonreligion in a Complex Future project as well. Her research interests include quantitative methods, sociology of religion, immigration and ethnicity, and political sociology. And last, but certainly not least, Jack Jedwab is president and CEO of the Association for Canadian Studies and the Metropolis Institute. He holds a PhD in Canadian history from Concordia University. Prior to 1998, he served as executive director of the Quebec branch of the Canadian Jewish Congress. His research focuses on immigration, multiculturalism, diversity, human rights, and official languages. He has taught and lectured at McGill University, the Université du Québec à Montréal, and Concordia University, offering courses ranging from public policy to the history of immigration and minority groups to sports in Canada. So with introductions out of the way, I will now turn things over to Laurie Beaman, the host of today's panel.
Thank you so much, Emma, and welcome everyone. I would like to begin by thanking Emma Robinson. She's done a phenomenal job of putting this panel together, of gathering all of you. One of the disadvantages of this format, the webinar format, is that we don't get to see all of you. We just see numbers. So it's a little bit less interactive than we would like, but given the numbers we anticipated, we chose this format, and I hope that it works well. I've asked Sarah Wilkins-LaFlamme to begin today to just give us a brief overview of the data we're talking about so that we can all situate ourselves in the broader question, religion in decline, understanding new data from Statistics Canada. So Sarah, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Laurie. So I'm just going to share my screen here. I got a couple of slides. So we're looking today at a report that Statistics Canada put out quite recently this year using data from the General Social Surveys, which is census data. It is not. The 2021 census data is coming out probably sometime next year, maybe 2023, depending on the schedule. But in some ways, this GSS data is almost better. It's a survey that the GSS, it's run pretty much almost once a year since 1985. In more recent years, it's got a very good quality sample of usually about 20,000 respondents from most parts of Canada, sometimes a bit more, sometimes a bit less, but it's got a very large sample, which is a great characteristic of the data. And that sample covers individuals 15 years and older in the kind of population that lives mostly in private households. These samples don't usually include people living in institutional settings, and this data only covers the 10 provinces, so it does not cover the Northern Territories. The nice thing about the GSS is that it has four, count them, ooh la la, 4 religiosity indicators or variables included. Since the beginning of the survey in 1985, they've asked about religious affiliation, frequency of religious service attendance. Service attendance is often referred to as group activity as well in the report. So if you hear us using that term, it's referring to that frequency of service attendance. And then more recently, since the earlier mid-2000s, also variables on the importance of religious and spiritual beliefs in life, as well as the frequency of more personal religious or spiritual activities, things like meditation, prayer, and so forth. So I just want to take a couple of minutes here to go over some of the key findings of the report before we get into actually discussing them as a group. So here on the next slide, I've got one of the main charts from the report. So this can be found on the report authored by Connellison on page 6. And so just so you're clear on what's happening here on the x-axis, so that's the horizontal axis, we have the years of the GSS, so from 1985 all the way to 2019. On the y-axis, we have the rate of or the percentage of people that we find with a certain religious characteristic within the wider population. So that's the estimated percentage based on GSS data. And then in the legend underneath, we have the kind of different indicators that are measured in the GSS. So the blue dotted line is group religious activities or attending religious services at least once a month. The red solid line is all those who say they have a religious affiliation. The blue solid line is those who say that their religious or spiritual beliefs are somewhat or very important in their lives. And then finally, the red dotted line are those individuals who have a personal religious activity at least once a week. So that was things like prayer and meditation that were mentioned in that survey question. And so the general trends here are of decline. That's the main finding probably in the report. All of these 4 indicators are declining across the years. And so, yeah, I figured this chart was a good illustration of some of those key results in the report. Another few key findings to mention. So in this report that I will put in the chat or will give you access somehow if you're interested. There's the kind of most up-to-date numbers we have on these indicators from StatsCan from 2019. So in 2019, we're finding that about 2/3 of Canadians identify with a religion. Just over half consider the religious or spiritual beliefs somewhat or very important in their lives. Just under a quarter attended religious services at least once a month. And just under a third said they engaged in religious or spiritual activities on their own at least once a week, things again like meditation or prayer. Even though, the graph in the previous slide showed a decline over time since 1985, that decline is especially happening between birth cohorts. So younger cohorts score even lower on these religiosity indicators. Groups who score a bit higher on these religiosity indicators include those born outside of Canada, also include women compared with men. And then there's some regional variations in the trends that are in the report. Key ones that the author highlights is that BC scores lower on most religiosity indicators. Quebec has like this kind of peculiar, what I've called it with my co-authors in existing works, kind of cultural Catholic landscape where a lot of people still say they're Catholic, not as many as before, but still many in the population in the province, whereas beliefs and practice are actually quite low comparatively. And also in Atlantic Canada, another trend the author highlights is that the decline across generations, the difference between generations is especially pronounced out east in Canada. Now, the report, in my opinion, doesn't make any kind of newfangled argument. It's kind of what I consider almost kind of standard fare from StatsCan. Their main argument in the report is that there are lots of different ways of doing religion, right? Religious diversity is not just between different religious affiliations, but also in how people practice their religions and spirituality. Okay, so that's it for now, and we'll launch the discussion from there. Thank you.
Sarah, thanks so much for that. And the way that we're going to work this from now for the next about 30 to 35 minutes is that I'll ask a series of questions of our panelists and invite them to reply. We'll start with the question, is there anything surprising in these results, in this latest data from Statistics Canada? And Brian, I thought I'd turn to you first on this one, because you in your book, I try to hold it out of my bookshelf, Leaving Christianity with Stuart MacDonald, you've discussed some of the trends and you've looked at the long view of this. And so I thought I'd start with you by asking you, is there anything new here?
Well, I mean, a lot of these trends are things that we've been, those of us who've been looking at religious affiliation, religious participation, and various ways that people participate. I don't think there's anything surprising here. I think we've been aware of some of the regional trends identified in this report, particularly BC. I think that's been on people's scanners for quite a while, because actually non-affiliation is one of the distinguishing marks of BC historically. I mean, it goes back a long way. The thing about cultural Catholicism in Quebec is also, I think, well recognized. But yeah, as Sarah was alluding to, non-religious affiliation is picking up slightly in Quebec. 2011 National Household Survey was quite interesting that way, particularly when you look at senior generations, people 65 and over, because I think pretty well for the first time you actually saw a bump in people 65 and older switching from self-identifying as Roman Catholic to no religion. Never seen that before. So I think things are changing in Quebec, but yeah, the trend of cultural Catholicism is a long-standing one. Some scholars have identified, the relationship that Quebecois have to the Catholic Church as being a hate-love relationship. It's an ambiguous one. But yeah, I mean, this is a trend that's been going on since the 1960s. And then finally with Atlantic Canada, I'm not so familiar with this one, but it is interesting because, when you look at the gap between generational cohorts, particularly with younger ones, that typically tells you a lot what might be coming down the pipe in future years, right? As younger people become age, become more prominent in the population demographic profile. This sort of indicates that things may be changing in Atlantic Canada. Atlantic Canada for a long time was probably, if you're looking for a religious heartland in Canada, Atlantic Canada would be the place you look at, right? So things are changing there. Interesting. So yeah, main trends were kind of, we've recognized. I thought there one interesting thing that came out in this report, though, the bump in affiliation after 2010. And what's interesting about that is that it seems to go across the age cohorts. It's not limited to one cohort. Not a big bump, but it's there. And I don't know whether it was a measurement issue or what, but it's certainly an interesting trend, and not one I think many of us were expecting to see.
Thanks so much, Brian, for those insights. Jack, anything new here from your perspective?
No. Actually, I just, as you know, I sort of want to be nice about this and be sort of good in terms of my academic side, but rather than having an aha moment, I had more of a ho-hum moment, to tell you the truth. I didn't feel there was anything particularly sort of that blew me away on this thing. Pretty standard, especially from where I'm sitting here in Quebec. No surprise about the sort of ongoing issue of affiliating or identifying as Catholic, but seeing that in sort of very cultural ways. So accounting for a lot of the gap. I find a lot of this, to be fair and with all due respect, and I still want to sort of congratulate the author, because there's a lot of work involved in doing this type of data, mining and so forth. But and so it's a bit of a microcosm also of a very Christian way of looking at this phenomenon, if I may say with all due respect, even though I don't think it's deliberately done that way. It just comes out that way because of the way we seem to construct a lot of these issues. So that was a bit my takeaway, and my aha is, here we go. It's a bit of a, it comes out where the conclusions are. Here's how Catholics in Quebec are sort of evolving. But then there's that big other category, and the author does refer to that category, mentions immigrants, right? So there is this sort of a higher level of religious affiliation, with respect to immigration, right? And who's coming to Canada. Again, I had no aha sort of moment with respect to that finding, but what it leads me to think is that we have absolutely to do more disaggregation of this data rather than making sort of the general statements about broad categories of peoples, and especially when we're growing more diverse in terms of our religious, if you like, demography. That diversity is something that I think almost essentially, if we're going to identify these aha opportunities, will have to be taken into consideration so that it's not just sort of binary ways of looking at things. And in that regard, let me say two very quick things as well. Part of this is a function of our census and the way the questions are constructed in our census. So I've actually thought that when you look at the religion census and the question, specify one denomination of religion only. There actually are people that will say I belong to more than one faith if they're encouraged to do so. We don't encourage them to do so. We do quite the opposite because we are framed or locked into this way of measuring things when it comes to religion. So we need to rethink the conceptual side of this. And it's hard to do that, I know, because it requires a discussion. But we've moved so much ahead in terms of our demographic change, and we're leaving our census behind, not catching up to the demographic changes and what they mean for our identities, right? So that's one of my immediate sort of thoughts about this. I know we can trace back if your mom and dad were, Catholic or Muslim, if you'd like. We can track back on that through the census data, right? But it doesn't speak to how you identify or define yourself, which we could do if we'd allow people to say more than one option. We do that for ethnicity, by the way. We allow people to declare up to 4 options. So I don't see why we wouldn't do that. Let me finally, Laurie, and I really apologize for what I'm about to do right now. I want to just do a shout out to my friend Paul Bramadad, who I haven't seen since COVID. I see he's on the list of participants, and just let Paul know if you're listening, and I hope you are, because some people black that screen and they're not listening. But if you are, right, I will be coming out to BC for a month with my partner from mid-January to mid-February, and I hope to see you then.
Thank you, Jack, for that combination of personal and professional. Though you said there were no surprises, I think you made some really important observations, and there are some things there that we need to think about. You've anticipated my next question, but I'm not going there quite yet because I'd like to have Peter weigh in on the question of anything new, as well as Sarah. So Peter, over to you.
Well, it depends. I mean, is there anything surprising in this latest data? It depends on who you are. And I imagine that some of us are not surprised by things that others might be surprised by. So this is not so much as surprising things, but I think there are a number of things that I think are really worth pointing out. One of them is actually kind of a what's not there. I'm involved in another project that has recently done a cross-Canada survey of this nature, a different theme, but many of the same kinds of questions. In fact, recruiting the same way that the GSS recruits, but with a much smaller number, only 1,500. And I don't think we're the only ones in that survey who are finding a level of non-religion much higher than the 26% that typically gets. I know the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada has had some survey done, perhaps also by the same. We had it done by Ipsos. So that's one thing that is kind of surprising here. It's consistent with Stats Canada data because the level of non-religion was 2011, 24%. Now it's 26, so it's gradually going up. But I'm wondering how we can understand this difference in results from different research projects. So that's one thing. Another thing that I noticed, and this actually tunes in with what Brian and Stuart have been doing, and that is what I would call not surprising, but very well demonstrated, is the continued de-denominationalization of religion in Canada. And by that I mean specifically Christian denominationalization, and perhaps with others as well. I'm not sure. But so that the other Christians that you and Stuart have done, first of all, they are still a very large. I mean, they're 14.7% of the population, but their internal characteristics, in terms of their religiosity, seems to ask a question of you and Stuart, because I know the analysis you delivered to Leaving Christianity about those, that they are largely belong to the marginal, less religious crowd. And here we have some data that might suggest maybe they're a mixture. So that's another question. The number of people who are in not the main line, which is Presbyterian, Lutheran, United, Roman Catholic, and Anglican, is very, very, very small now. It's only about 7.5% of the population are, Baptist, Pentecostal, all that kind of stuff. And I'm wondering, I mean, whether that's particularly significant under the title of de-denominationalization. The world religions people are, this is not surprising, but it's worth noting, are increasing consistently, right? And we know that they are somewhat dominated by Muslims because they're by and large the largest category. And then I guess the final thing I'll say is that with regard to Quebec, I found that there was this one little graph there or figure which did the generational thing. And I noted that what Sarah and Martin and others have found is that the most recent generation in Quebec seems really to be moving very strongly ahead on maintaining a high percentage of what we call cultural Catholics. But the non-religious people are really squeezing the religious people out in that graph, right? So they have a very, very small portion of the millennial generation that now comes off on the religious measures as relatively solid and high, whereas their marginals, their cultural Catholic or whatever you want to call them, are maintaining, I think it was over 40%. This is actually in sharp contrast, even to British Columbia, where even there, the youngest generation is, what I might say, looks more religious, quote unquote, than the youngest generation in Quebec. I thought that was pointing out I'm very well aware that over the past 20 years, there has been a sea change. There's been a significant sea change in Quebec, as well as in other parts of the country, but it's very peculiar and specific to Quebec. And I think this data actually gives some very, very good evidence of that continued difference. There's more, but that's
Thanks,
enough.
Peter. I can already see we're not going to get through all the questions that I had imagined we would, but that's fine because some of you are anticipating those questions, and it's making for a good discussion as best we can do in a panel when we're all in different places. And I would point out to people that we will have time for questions at the very end. We've left about 15 minutes, so not a lot, but we will have some time for discussion. Sarah, I'd like to end this question with you. Anything surprising here?
Yeah, thanks, Laurie. So I've been working with this GSS data since 2008, so a long time now. So yeah, there's nothing really surprising like with the other panelists here. I think the most surprising thing for me was that StatsCan actually wrote a report on religiosity, which doesn't happen that often. So that was exciting. Just maybe touch on a few points that Brian and Jack mentioned. So Brian, you mentioned the kind of plateauing of affiliation numbers since 2010. So between 2010 and 2018, the rate of people who said they had no religion stayed pretty stable around the 22 to 25% mark. I think that is a measurement issue with the GSS. Peter mentioned that other surveys had been finding much higher rates than that. I think StatsCan was playing around a bit with how they worded the religious affiliation question, which had a bit of an impact on numbers. And also, I think StatsCan also, like many of us, struggle to get younger respondents in their surveys, right? These are still, for the most part, the GSS is still mostly a telephone survey, and who answers telephone surveys anymore? Some people do, but a lot of people don't. And so their response rates have gone down. They're now around 40% for the GSS. And so I think they've been kind of struggling. And I see that maybe since 2018, the no religion numbers shot up really quickly. So they went from like about a quarter of the population to about a third of the population between 2018 and 2019. I don't think that it was like suddenly there were a whole bunch more non-religious people out there. I think it was more like the sampling was catching up a bit and was improved for the more recent years. But it's a larger discussion about measurement that I won't get into too much here today. But that always does impact these numbers to a certain extent. Actually, to come back to Jack's point, I'm not a fan of asking people about multiple religious affiliations. Sorry, Jack. I know we all have different opinions on this, but I feel that longitudinal comparison with the StatsCan data is what it actually brings to the table, and I feel we should keep that because there is value in that comparison over time, over decades, and in some cases even centuries with the census data. And when I've tried asking affiliation questions in my own surveys, like as a multiple affiliations, question, we don't get a huge amount of people selecting multiple affiliations. Maybe that's just a product of how the question's been asked for so long. But I think, yeah, discussion to be had, but be careful there, because I do think there's especially value with StatsCan about the longitudinal comparison. And finally, for me, one thing maybe that was a little bit interesting to see with this report was, I work a lot with BC and Quebec context, so I know them quite well. But for me, seeing Atlantic Canada and some of the unique trends out east was maybe more interesting. The fact that, in Atlantic Canada, these religiosity indicator numbers only really started declining in the 1990s, which was much later than in the rest of Canada. BC started way earlier. Ontario started, like Brian said, around the 60s, 70s. Atlantic Canada only started around the 90s, but since then seem to be catching up because the decline is accelerated almost. There's that wider gap between generations. So it's interesting to see, and probably a lot more work to be done on the East Coast context.
Thanks, Sarah, very much. And I meant to do, a little book promo too for yours. I have gathered it as well by my desk, yours and Joel's. Really very interesting book, None of the Above, which is highly recommended reading as well for people who want to begin to understand the decline, if you will. The next question that I had for you all was, how does Statistics Canada measure religion, non-religion? Are we using the right questions? Now, we've got into that a little bit already, and there's a bit of a difference in opinion, perhaps, between Jack and Sarah. I was going to start with Peter on this one, though, because I know Peter's been working under the Non-Religion in a Complex Future project. He's been designing and testing a survey that is trying to do some measurement as well. So Peter, I'll start with you on this one. Are we measuring the right things? Are there other things we need to be thinking about?
Well, it's as you know, it's a much larger question, because it begins as what is it that we're trying to measure? We're trying to measure religion, and as we know from all the work that we've done, what not religion is depends entirely on what religion is. And we're here in this work, we are measuring it in, shall we say, the traditional ways, which is largely Christian-centered, and to the degree which is not Christian-centered, it is certainly world religion-centered. And we know that the world religions category itself is controverted. That said, however, our research does tend to show that there is a high correlation between the measures. For instance, Stats Canada saying there are different ways of being religious, and then promptly tells us there's really only three. There is exactly the ones that Brian, there's the religious people who tend to do religion in a kind of an expected way. Then there's the wishy-washy, fuzzy, marginal middle, which is really quite large, and they do a little to nothing. And then there's the people who have clearly located themselves on the off the religion category. The people who mix and match differently are there, much like the multiple religious people that Jack and Sarah were just talking about. They're there, but they're not a particularly large group. I think I remember the tables that this report produced, and some of their options were pretty empty for how to put religion together. I think that within those kinds of parameters, there are things that I would like to see that I have used in my own research, different measurements, for instance, self-described religiosity. But there as well, I don't think that the results are going to be anything meaningfully different than, even just using religious affiliation the way the census does, right? And we all know that religious affiliation doesn't mean all that much, but it seems to correlate highly with the things that we think do mean a lot. And therefore, I would say, are they measuring religion properly? Says, well, it's a perfectly justifiable and still viable and important way of measuring religion, without cutting off other approaches, which, by the way, are being tried and have been tried for some time, and they all have their characteristic problems, right? So it's not an issue that is easily solved by saying, oh, well, you're doing it wrong, we have to do it this way. This is the right way of doing it, but it's not the only way.
Thanks, Peter. Jack, I'm wondering if you would like to weigh in on this, because you hinted at this in your first response, and Sarah has taken you to task on something, but I was intrigued by the comment you made about it's very Christian looking. Would you like to talk a little bit more about what we're measuring and what we should be measuring?
So actually, I'd like to, Sarah, I'm double vaxxed and I don't know where you are. And so I'd like to actually take some time to persuade you to rethink your position on this thing. I think, when I was a kid, by the way, I had a train set, and my parents told me I'm a real track breaker, right? So I think in this particular case, if I can apply that sort of line to the census, I do think we needed at some stage, whether it's GSS or census, to break some tracks. Not only around this issue, but I think in other areas as well. There's times where we have to say that this track that we've taken for this number of years no longer reflects what's happening out there, at least in terms of blurring of identities that is taking place with respect to ethnicity very clearly, with respect to language, with respect to racialization, not only here, but in other large immigrant receiving societies that are quite diverse and complex. So we need to find a way to sort of get across that bridge. I'm sorry, we're on sort of these structural track bridges, get across that bridge, if you like, towards seeing how we can adjust the census to take that into account. I'm quite persuaded, by the way, despite what Peter said, that in my home province of Quebec, Peter, are you in Gatineau or Ottawa, by the way? Just out of curiosity. Ottawa? Oh, Ottawa. See, so you're in Ontario, it's different. Like if you're across that, like if you take that 2-kilometer trip, the reality is something very different, where I am in here in Quebec. So these people who are nominally Catholic, right? I think we can say that they're nominally Catholic in many cases. They would describe themselves very much as no religion. In fact, from the standpoint of their salience of their identities, they probably fit into what would be described as a no religion box. They just don't define themselves that way from sort of in terms of the way things are framed. So if you would adapt the ethnicity question to the religion question and say, answer more than one, feel free to offer more than one, I think it would change the dynamics. Now, whether you do that or not is a good question. And I totally agree with Sarah. Once you do that, it changes things. It's not going to be comparable over that sort of longitudinal or, or if you like, census to census recording. But I do think at a certain point, we need to make the jump, take the leap, and see where we land, because it helps us to adapt to what's going on out there, which we really do need to adapt to if we're going to get into the salience of these identities and the relationship between the identification and salience, which will require other questions as well, of course. But we need to some point make that jump. So Sarah, if I could just, if you come to Vancouver, I'm getting together with Paul. He doesn't know this yet. We can all discuss this issue. And we'll invite David Seljak too and the company, so.
Okay, Jack. No, you can't make your dinner arrangements on this webinar. So,
Sorry.
Sarah, I'd like to go to you.
Well,
I'd to go to you next, because I feel like you might want to respond.
I know Paul Bramadad's answer. I think he agrees with you, Jack, on this front, on the multiple affiliations front. Listen, we could debate this forever, right? Like you get 4 quantitative specialists in a room and survey methodologists in a room, and they'll have 4 different ways of asking your questions that are important, right? Like your religiosity questions or whatnot. So that's always an ongoing thing. I still feel like I felt there was a loss going with ethnicity, multiple ethnicities, in terms that we can no longer compare that data. And that's my feeling. But yeah, again, everyone's got their own opinion, and that's cool. I guess with the GSS, what I see the real value in is the sample, not so much the questions. Like, yes, there's 4 questions. They're like Peter said, they're decent questions if you want to measure religion in a more kind of conventional, traditional way, but which is a lot for StatsCan. Most StatsCan surveys don't have any questions on religion at all, or just 1 or 2 if you're lucky, but 4 is quite good. But the sample is really what the GSS brings to the table. So this is probably as close as we can get to a true probability sample in Canada. It's not perfect, right? There's some coverage bias, there's some non-response bias, so it's never perfect. But this is, usually 20,000 or roughly thereabouts people from across the 10 provinces, gotten in a pretty random way with decent response rates, when, especially if you compare it to, say, other types of surveys we run, say like online public opinion polls or surveys we run as academics. So it's really the sample that they bring to the table. It still has issues. I mentioned them earlier on, right? They're still struggling in young people and so forth, but it's still much better quality than anything we can usually get when we run a survey. And so I think that's where, it's used as a benchmark for other surveys in some cases to kind of compare sample composition with. And I think that's really what, for me, these data bring to the table. So yeah, we can debate measurement forever, and I'm sure we will. And it's a good debate to have. It's an important debate to have. But I think with the GSS, it's I love it for the sample. Yeah.
No, sorry, I understand where you're coming from. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
Oh, good. We're all still friends. I'm going to give the last word to Brian on this question. Brian, I don't want to push you into an identity corner, but the historian's perspective is always valued and appreciated. So what's your view on this? What are we measuring? Are we measuring the right things? Do we need to do things differently?
Well, as a historian, historians don't design surveys, right? We go into the archives and we read the surveys that other people have designed. But I would make one comment about the attitudinal surveys, survey aspect of Stats Canada. It's the way they group things. Something is very important and somewhat important, and then it gets lumped together as you total up the two amounts, right? Now, the Collins definition of somewhat, dictionary of somewhat, is a bit. So hypothetical question, Jack's been talking about going out for dinner. So hypothetical question, were you to go out for dinner with a group of friends and you asked them, so how did you like this restaurant? And they said, a bit. I don't think you'd be going back there. So I don't understand. This may be a naive comment, but I don't understand how you can group very important and somewhat important and say, this is actually a measure of saliency. It quite literally does not add up to me.
I'm going to ask one last question. Asking the panelists to keep in mind that we would like to keep some time for questions, and we will end the panel on the hour, so except in Newfoundland. So with that being said, and I'm going to ask a big question. So the challenge is on, what factors are driving this decline, if we can call it this decline, in religious affiliation and participation? What's driving this? Where's it coming from? And that's a big question that nobody's answered so far yet. I don't think in Canada, lots of people have tried. Brian, let's start with you.
Okay, I'll give it try to give it a start. I actually think this is part of a larger trend. Many years ago, well, a century ago, Arthur Schlesinger Sr., historian of the United States, wrote an article in the American Historical Review called Americans, a Society of Joiners. And quite frankly, a century ago, you could have written the same article about Canada. I remember when I first moved to Toronto back in the 1970s, every time I'd walk to do some research in the archives or go to the university library, I normally walk by a number of churches, lost count of how many on a 30 to 35-minute walk, but I also walked by many meeting halls, Orange halls, Foresters halls, Masonic halls. The list would just go on and on. And one of the things that's happened since World War II in Canada is that many of those organizations have seen large numbers of disaffiliation. I mean, who remembers the Orange Order these days, or the Foresters for that matter, right? But they're a major part of the associational landscape in Canada. So I think one thing to look at is, how has this whole ecology of civil society changed in the post-war period? That's the kind of question that intrigues me, because the organizations that have been involved in this shift had a very particular pattern of behavior, right? They met regularly at set times and places. They were in-person organizations. And they met at a specific place, usually their own meeting place. I mean, it's hard to remember this, but many organizations had their own meeting quarters actually. Why? Because that's what people did. And before the rise of suburbs in the post-war period, many Canadian cities were walking cities. I mean, people lived, worked, and associated within their neighborhood. They didn't go much beyond it. And I think that's one of the big shifts that's happened, and churches are part of that shift. So I'd like to put that whole trend of disaffiliation into a larger framework. No one's done it yet. I think it'd be really interesting to do it.
Thanks, Brian. That's really helpful. I'm going to take a risk here and ask if any of the other panelists would like to weigh in on this rather than calling on people specifically, which could result in chaos, in which case I will quickly retain control of the conversation. But any of the panelists want to weigh in to respond to Brian or raise something new? Sarah, then Peter.
Thank you. Just quickly, yeah, like we're no longer in the same society anymore. I guess I like to turn that question on its head and say, like, why were so many people involved with a religious group in the 19th and early 20th century, right? In society, right? Like, why was that? And we're not in that society anymore. Brian speaks to the kind of what that Putnam argument of bowling alone, of kind of the decline of these in-person organizations in many cases in civil society. Also, like the church is no longer the center of social and public life in the center of the village, right? Like there's other options now, there's secular alternatives. And so, it's still, religious groups are still important for some in society, and that's going to continue. Even in BC, you still see a minority who are involved, and I think that's going to keep going. They're fed by non-Western immigration, higher fertility rates as well. So there's a demographic effect there as well. But in terms of, the rest, a bigger chunk of the population, that pressure, that need to be there is gone, right? It's shifted elsewhere. We're doing other things with our time. And yeah, it's part of, like Brian says, part of this kind of larger shift of changing society, and religion's kind of caught up a bit in an old model in a sense, and hasn't maybe updated in a way that people still feel that it's worth their time and effort, right?
I think I can weigh in as well on this, Laurie. I like to do this by quoting from one of my least favorite clerics in our history, Lionel Groulx, right? He once said, I recall, this is a quote from a Susan Mankoff, Susan Mann publication, that he discouraged people to go to the cities in Quebec because the cities had prostitutes and, oh my God, Jews, right? Like people like myself. So really, if you think about it, urbanization, if we go back historically, urbanization and that terrible thing called mixing, right? Also, that is a function of urbanization and breaking down of barriers and the loss of a lot of control of organized religion over some of the very basic institutions of society, like charitable institutions, which were very important to the maintaining of the following of various religious denominations, again, mainly in the sort of Catholic, sort of Protestant sphere. And also more recently in the 21st century, late 20th, 21st, I think scandals have really affected people's views around organized religion. So a lot of the sort of issue around no religion, for example, in terms of that transfer of reporting in the census, there was a big shift, I recall, from Anglican identification to no religion, right? If you try to measure out why that happened. And it coincided around the time the census was being conducted with some significant scandals involving the Anglican branch of the faith, right? So that's, I think, those factors. And I don't think we can all measure them, but all that, if you like, taken together, that sort of recipe, if you like, or mix, probably has contributed to this decline of religion and continues to do that. There's also that other thing called science that, is another thing that probably has some impact on this as well.
Peter, you had your hand up too. Thank you so much, Jack, for that. We are into our question time now, and we do have questions. So Peter, do you have a very brief addition before we turn to the listening audience to see what they'd like to know, or what the questions are they'd like to pose?
No, I don't have a brief one, so I'll just pass. I mean, a brief one for me? Come on.
I know. I just thought I'd ask. Sorry about that, Peter. And if there's time left after the questions, we can still keep going with this. If it's any consolation, I only posed 3 of my 4 questions that I'd intended to ask. So Emma, over to you for the question.
Great, thank you so much, Laurie, and thank you to all our panelists. That was such a fascinating discussion. So we've got a few questions in the Q&A chat. Just so everybody's up to speed, you are welcome to ask your questions through the Q&A. However, if you wish to ask out loud, just raise your hand, please. We will then unmute you and you can ask your question. We just ask that you don't forget to lower your hand afterwards. But to begin, I'm just going to work through those questions that we have in the chat. So our first question is from Paul Bramadat, and the question is, what do the 4 or 5 of you think about the role of the category of belief in this study? Are we in some sense handcuffed by the fact that we've been talking about and measuring quote unquote beliefs for a long time, even though we now recognize quite well how limited or limiting that category is?
Okay.
Can I just jump in? Or do you
Peter.
moderate, right?
Yes, jump in.
Where is the category of belief in those 4 questions?
Salience of belief, Peter. The importance of religious or spiritual beliefs in life.
Oh, the importance of the beliefs. Okay, sorry. That clarifies that. Yeah, it's. I would simply say that I have always had trouble with the importance question. It works reasonably well here, but as Brian pointed out, it invites you to put somewhat and vary in the same in different categories in the same category with either results. You're not quite sure what to do with this thing. But on the other hand, I think in the aggregate, it indirectly does get at what we're trying to get at to some degree, right? So it's again like it's one of these, you ask one question and it's not really the only question or maybe even the right question, but it correlates so highly with a number of other questions that you could ask that are better, that this will do more or less. That's not taking away anything from the kind of criticism that we've leveled at these questions already.
Thanks, Paul, for that question. That was Paul Bramadat. And Paul, I hope you're getting ready for all the dinner guests you're about to have to talk about these very serious issues. I am going to weigh in on belief. I'm far more interested in practice. And what do people do? What do people do rather than what they say they believe in terms of studying religion and, of course, right now, non-religion, but also that I think heads us toward the future in terms of thinking about how do we live well together in a society where we have so many varying constituencies. What are the things that people do together? How do they have contact? What does that mean? What are the results of that? But I'll turn back to the panelists to ask if anyone else would like to weigh in on belief.
Yeah, just to jump in, Laurie, to extend that is that it's the group behavior that matters on other social and political behaviors, especially, right? So if you're actually measuring the impact of someone's religiosity on how they vote, if they volunteer, if they're caregivers, whatever the social behavior is, when there is a religiosity factor, and there often is, it's the behavior and not necessarily the belief, even though beliefs very, like Peter says, highly correlated with practice often. It's the group behavior that often matters most. So that's the one I'm interested in. That being said, ideally you have a battery of questions that get at different dimensions of religion, religiosity, spirituality, but that's not so much the case with the government data. It costs a lot of money to include questions in these big surveys. And so there's only a small number. And yeah, is this the best use of a question? Well, it's the one we have now, and we have some longitudinal data for it. So why not include it in the mix, right? Yeah.
Anyone else on belief before we go to the next question? No hands? Okay. Emma, over to you.
All right, so we've got a question now from Gregory Blomquist. So this question, discussion of percentages seems to ignore changes in absolute numbers and is potentially misleading. For example, quote, meanwhile, the proportion of people who attended group religious activities at least once a month nearly halved from 43% to 23% in 2019 is misleading. If the population in 1985 was 26 million and 43% of that is 11 million, and 2019 was 37 million and 23% of that is 8.5 million, then the attending population decreased not by half, but only by 1/5. The same problem exists at several points in the analysis of text statistics. This 1/5 change is quite different from 1/2. It also suggests not just decline, but rather a potential increase in immigrants who do not attend religious ceremonies. So this is the question comment. Do the panelists have any thoughts? Yes, go ahead, Sarah.
Yeah, no, good points. You know, there are always limits to what each of these statistics tell us. They're just summary points of kind of larger data. Yeah, here we're talking about percentages of the estimated percentages of the general adult population. And so, like you say, it's not talking about percentage change of absolute numbers, right? So yes, it's obviously, if you want to do a more in-depth detailed analysis, it's also important to look at those numbers, because in some cases a population percentage can stay stable, but that actually means an increasing number of actual people doing something, even though it's keeping on par with population growth, right? So yes, and all good points. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, sorry to jump in on that. It's just, I think it's, oh, Lori, can I jump in on that? Okay. I think it's sort of this ongoing debate, which is true for other sort of identity-based issues in the relation routine, weight and size, right? You can sort of grow in size while losing weight, right? I suppose, if you wish, right? So that's basically the issue here. And then it becomes a question of, based on the sort of phenomenon you're looking at, what's more important? With respect to religion, I think a lot of the experts will say weight or impact, if you like, as measured by weight in this case, is probably more important in terms of monitoring this particular phenomenon. So I think that's the answer, but I fully understand what you know, the person asking the question is saying. I mean, here in Quebec, where, as some of you may be familiar, we're having this debate about this thing called Bill 21, you know, about religious symbols or signs. So, you know, you'll hear various experts weigh in and say, and look at this type of data, right, that we're looking at. Stats can say, religion's on the decline. That's why we need Bill 21. And or religion's on the rise. That's why we need Bill 21. You know, so it sort of measures in public policy. But the paradox of by the way, which I haven't mentioned, of this data here is that if I were to do a poll asking Quebecers, and for that matter, other Canadians, whether you think religion is on the rise, most people will say yes. The majority, I've done it, will say yes, religion is on the rise quite significantly, right? So, which is not, you know, runs counter to what the data is actually telling us when, you know, measured on that, you know, on that micro scale, if you like, you know, across individuals rather. So, you know, there's that paradox, but, you know, it's good for policymakers. Religion's on the rise, got to have Bill 21. No, it's on the decline, got to have Bill 21.
If I can just contribute to that, what I would say in answer to Greg is that context matters. And then that's where proportion comes in. 50 years ago, when I was a young lad, as it were, or at least a teenager, then if you walked out to out your door on a Sunday morning in the very, very early 60s and the 50s, you found a lot of people going to church, right? Your environment was much more imbued with the presence of religion and its practice. That is far less the case today. And I think that's one of the reasons why the generations keep on in this, especially as in this research, become, each generation has this experiences, this decline, is because they are progressively living in a less religious atmosphere than their parents did, and so on back a couple of generations. And as I summarize, context matters.
Yeah, sorry. It's also not as much, those venues are not as much places for socialization. You know, when I was 50 years ago, when I was a teenager, you know, and I went to synagogue, I wanted to see if I could meet my next girlfriend there, you know. So, you know, today that's not where I'd go, you know. So I'm just saying, and I suspect that's probably true for people from other faiths as well. It's just not the area where you're going to make those connections and, you know, and you know, and those partnerships. Although they got that eHarmony stuff, right? Because I think is, you know, if, you know, using the technologies now to connect people through sort of platforms that are sort of religiously based. Is it eHarmony? I think it's one of them. You know, it's sort of a Christian dating site, if you know.
Christian Mingle. Christian Mingle.
Getting up to speed. Oh God, it's Christian Mingle. Oh, sorry, wrong one. I don't know. See, so it shows you what I know. You know. That's when you've been the same partner for 30 years. You don't keep up with these trends. So,
but and in reverse, it also shows, and other research I'm involved in is showing this very, very clearly. Context matters, and therefore, in this environment, if you're going to maintain and perpetuate religion, especially across generations, then you have to assure a religious community for your kids, right? It's not just, it's not enough to teach them at home. You have to have the community. And that's why, you know, among the religious groups that are doing better, they put much more emphasis on, you know, being a member of a church, participating in that, going to the corresponding schools and all this kind of stuff. And that is that, and it also points to what another one thing that Sarah is involved in, the whole polarization thesis, right? That yes, the percentage proportion is declining, but that proportion that Greg points to, which is still substantive, is, as it were, becoming more intense.
May I jump in actually with another question that is tied, I think, to some of this discussion about religious community. So Janet Buckingham asks, social isolation has been identified as a huge challenge in Canadian society. Do you think this is related to the decline of organized religion?
So I got asked that question at the Missionary Alliance megachurch in Calgary, which was a very different context than this one. And actually, my colleague Joel answered something interesting in that he at Ambrose University would also see issues of social isolation amongst his much more Christian student body. So I think social isolation is a problem that all groups are dealing with in our society, and not just non-religious ones. You know, and I guess my thinking as a bit of a cynic is, to what extent is it actually more of a problem now, or that we're just more talking about it more now? Obviously, yeah, we are in a more individualized society. We're not getting together in person anymore. But that being said, young people do find community elsewhere, especially on the digital world, in the digital world. And I feel like that often gets lost. Like, we talk about what's declined, but we haven't talked about what's kind of come up and replaced it. And that is, you know, an important source of community, whatever anyone thinks about it. It is an important source of community for many young people. And so, yeah, social isolation is an ongoing issue. I'm not sure, at least in this social context, I'm not sure if, you know, obviously religious groups do provide a certain form of community that can help towards that. For some individuals, it can also create other problems, like too much social pressure or abuse, even in some cases. And so there's like the other extreme. But yeah, I'm not convinced it's just a non-religion problem. Let's put it that way.
Thanks, Sarah. Anyone else like to weigh in on that? If not, we might have time for one last question. And that was, I liked this question because it is pressing us to think about the global context. And Darren Schmidt asks, thinking of broader trends, phenomena, there are indications that the globe is becoming more religious rather than less. And of course, Pew data emphasizes that. Does this affect how we approach or understand the Canadian picture? Would anyone like to speak to that?
I don't want to hog the mic, so if anyone else wants to jump in, please do. It means that if Canada still accepts many or more immigrants moving forward, we're going to get a lot of religiosity coming from those, especially non-Western immigration, and that's not going away. And that's an important demographic feeder. Like, I see things, especially in terms of demographics, right? That's just my background. And so, you know, there are people switching, disaffiliating, changing religions, but the big feeder of religious groups or non-religious groups in Canada are things like birth, migration, and death, right? And so, whereas in Canada, it's non-religion is growing still. There might be a plateau at some point we hit because of demographics, but we haven't hit it yet. So it doesn't look like necessarily other parts of the world on that front, but other parts of the world are affecting us, obviously, because we're a global connected society, but also because we're getting a very large amount of immigration, right? It's kind of been on pause with COVID. We haven't received as much migration as we usually do in Canada, but if the Liberals are planning to up their quotas to compensate for that, that's a big driver. And so it does mean that, you know, religion's not going anywhere. It's going to become more diverse. It already is. But that's I see as the main factor of that dynamic in Canada. Yeah.
We are out of time, unfortunately, and I thank you, Sarah, for that very, very succinct and insightful response to that question. I also note that there are many more questions, and give my apologies to those of you who have not had a chance to have your question asked and answered. But we will end here. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank each of the panelists, experts on this whole area of thinking about trends around religiosity, non-religion, thinking about demographics, as Sarah has just noted, and asking the questions around religion in decline and religion perhaps in decline, but as I've heard, I think many of the voices on the panel saying it's not going anywhere. It's just changing shape, and we need to think about that and maybe tweak the questions we're asking to perhaps reflect that. We'll continue that debate. Sarah's nodding her head no, so I won't even say that, Sarah. We will do another panel like this. Jack has a new survey that he'd like to talk about in some depth, and so we'll do another panel perhaps in January, we're hoping, and we'll send round notification to all of you. Emma, is there anything else that you'd like to add to this?
No, not for now, but I would like to add my thanks to everybody for attending today. And thank you to our panelists as well.
Thanks to everyone for attending, yes, and to the panelists, and we'll see you hopefully in January.